140 years ago, in 1884, 1885, European leaders conducted a historical conference in the city of Berlin, Germany. The conference was about ways of scrambling Africa among themselves. Afterwards, Europeans entered to Africa and colonized almost the entire continent. In that tough time of colonization, there was one country that successfully defended its sovereignty and independence from foreign aggressors from European colonization. That country was Ethiopia. On the 1st of March 1896, Ethiopians defeated Italian aggressors, colonizers at the Battle of Adwa. Ethiopia's resounding victory over Italy ignited anti-colonial struggle across Africa. Hello and very warm welcome to you all. My guest for today is Professor Raymond Jonas. Professor Raymond Jonas is Professor of History at the University of Washington in United States of America. Professor Raymond Jonas is the author of the book, The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire. Professor Raymond Jonas is in Seattle, United States. We are reaching Professor Raymond via Zoom. Hello, Professor, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's an honor and privilege to have you in our show. Thank you very much for making time to conduct this interview. But first, can you paint the picture of the Battle of Adwa for our mass audience, like why and how the Battle of Adwa was fought, and what were the consequences, the outcomes of the Battle of Adwa?
Yes, the fighting that breaks out in 1896, in fact, has a long history, which I'm sure your listeners and viewers can acquaint themselves with. But what matters in terms of the Battle of Adwa is that this is a decisive conflict between Ethiopian forces and Italian forces. Italians had pushed as far south as Lake Ashenge, and this was an intolerable situation from the Ethiopian point of view. Menelik and Taitu organized their forces, and the key to their strategy is to organize an overwhelming force, that is an Ethiopian force of at least 80,000 and possibly as large as 120,000. This would overwhelm the Italians, who are thinking in much more conventional colonial warfare terms. The Italians have mobilized about 15,000 troops, as well as about 6,000 mercenaries, known colloquially as askari. So in total, they have about 20,000. And what Emperor Menelik has done is to organize an audience or an army of overwhelming size. There are preliminary conflicts at Lake Ashenge, at Ambalaje, and Mekele, but the decisive conflict happens at Adwa on the 1st of March, 1896. You asked about the consequences of the war. The most obvious one is that Italy is forced out of Ethiopian territory, forced to retreat into Eritrea, or what they've called Eritrea. This is, for them, of course, a humiliating defeat. For Ethiopia, of course, it consolidates the Ethiopian territory and Ethiopian state, and at the same time consolidates the rule of Emperor Menelik and Empress Taitu.
Apparently, Adwa victory is not an ordinary victory. In fact, the victory of Adwa has multiple consequences and implications. I will come to those important points later in the interview. But how Ethiopians were able to defeat Italy, well prepared, well organized, and modern army of Italy?
Italians are in fact surprised and in fact deeply concerned when they find out that the Ethiopian forces have congealed, that they have come together and they're able to fight together effectively as a single army. Their military intelligence tells them that Ethiopian forces are likely to be torn apart by internal differences. And that's not based on, simple rumor. I mean, there's evidence to suggest that there are differences and these could break out into the open. But in fact, they don't. And that's the secret to Ethiopian victory at Adwa. When the fight actually happens on the 1st of March, 1896, the size of the Ethiopian army is such that it completely overwhelms, completely envelops the Italian positions. Once the fight begins, there's really no doubt about the outcome. The Ethiopian strategy is one of envelopment, and it turns out to be a successful strategy. Well, I think part of the story of Adwa is that Ethiopians, despite profound differences, are able to come together. And in a sense, it's an old story about how people who don't necessarily always agree are forced to come together and work together because of an external threat. It's the challenge of Italy to Ethiopia, ultimately, that causes people to set aside some very real and profound differences for the sake of a common good. That's the story in effect of it's a very, in a sense, a common story that people have to set aside differences in order to prevail in a common project, and it is very clearly an example that we can take from the story of the Battle of Adwa.
How do you investigate the contribution of Ethiopian leadership, the then leadership of Ethiopia, such as King Menelik and his wife Empress Taitu, in winning the battle?
So what's interesting about the way the campaign unfolds, because you have to remember that this is a campaign that carries on for months. And one of the great challenges of any army is how you keep an army fed, how you keep its spirits high. I mean, morale is important for a successful army. And so part of the wonder, if you like, of the Adwa campaign is that Emperor Menelik and Empress Taitu are able to keep this army together, keep morale relatively high, keep the army fed over hundreds of miles from where the campaign begins when they leave Addis Ababa, all the way up to this decisive encounter at Adwa. It's not an easy thing to do. This is a part of what you could call a logistical challenge, but it's part of their success has to do with the fact that they're joined by armies along the way. At Ambalaje, for example, at Mekele, the size of the Ethiopian forces grow as they're joined by forces from other parts of the country. And it's this very skillful campaign ultimately that assures the success of the campaign.
In your book titled The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire, you depicted the notion that the victory of Adwa is the victory of Africa. How do you come to say that?
So yes, I mean, it is a victory for Africa because what it shows is that Africa can be free. I mean, that's the ultimate lesson of the Battle of Adwa. Up until 1896 and the 1st of March and this decisive combat, there's a strong presumption on the part of Europeans, and you mentioned the Congress of Berlin, there's a strong presumption on the part of Europeans that Africa ultimately will be dominated by European imperial powers. And what the Battle of Adwa shows is that that future is not inevitable. That's the future that's projected for Africa, but it's not an inevitable future. And what the Battle of Adwa does is to, in effect, to put a stop to this particular ambition and this particular vision of the future. And it simply says, you know, this isn't a necessary future. There are other futures that we can imagine, including a future where Africa is free.
Ethiopia gained that magnificent, resounding victory over Italy by the time the whole Africa were under the colony of Europe. So how Adwa victory ignited anti-colonial struggle across Africa and across black people around the world?
The symbolic force of Adwa is there all the time. And that's one of the reasons why in the African diaspora, the, uh, the colors of the African flag, for example, uh, are an important part of a kind of Pan-African patriotism that it's the symbolic importance of Ethiopia ultimately that matters for people in the Caribbean, for people in sub-Saharan Africa, for people in the United States of African heritage. They can look to Ethiopia as this example of what African can be in terms of freedom and sovereignty.
Professor Raymond Jonas, Professor of History at the University of Washington in the United States of America, I thank you very much for taking time to conduct this interview, and I hope I will see you in another show. I thank you very much, Professor.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, that was my interesting interview with Professor Raymond Jonas, Professor of History at the University of Washington in USA. Professor Raymond Jonas is also author of the book, The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire. I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I did. Many thanks for watching, and bye for now.